Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Cell and Gene, the podcast. I'm your host, Erin Harris, and I'm excited to have with me and introduce to you Dr. Bambi Grilley. Bambi is Professor of Pediatrics and the Director of Clinical Research and Early Product Development for the Center of Cell and Gene Therapy at Baylor College of Medicine, and she is the Chief Regulatory Officer at ISCT. Bambi is here to talk to us about not only her role at ISCT, but also about the global regulatory landscape for cell and gene therapies, as well as the pediatric patient journey. And so, Bambi, welcome to Cell and Gene, the podcast. I'm so glad you're here with us.
I'm very excited to be here. This is a big treat for me, and I'm really glad you invited me. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you took me up on our offer. Okay, so let's start off with ISCT. So you are ISCT's Chief Regulatory Officer. Talk to us about the Chief Regulatory Officer for ISCT role. So what is your primary focus in this role? What is your primary focus for this year? And also just kind of talk us through what you're thinking for the near term.
So the Chief Regulatory Officer for ISCT is primarily focused on regulatory initiatives worldwide. And I think in the beginning, cell and gene therapy was, as you and your listeners are well aware, primarily an unapproved area, right? It was a lot of research, a lot of clinical research, basic laboratory research. Now we're getting into an era where there's a lot more approved products. And so I think that the regulatory focus has moved from being that pre-approval, IND, CTD, all of the different terms used worldwide for approvals, for pre-approval, to also talking about post-approval. And I think that what's interesting about ISCT is it is international. And so we do have a legal regulatory affairs group in the United States called the North American one. There's one in South America. There's an EU version. And then there's also, we've been working pretty hard on setting one up in the APAC, Asia Pacific region. There's already in Australia, New Zealand, legal and regulatory affairs. And so one of the things that I feel like I do as the CRO is keep all of those different groups speaking to each other. And we have what we call the Global Regulatory Task Force that meets regularly, where we talk about what's going on in our regions and try and talk about how we can harmonize or how we can learn from each other. We also do group initiatives at the annual meeting, which is being held in May. The Global Regulatory Task Force has several different sessions where we're going to be talking about case studies and talking through different issues of what different things might mean. And so the specific example that we're using this year, which I think kind of answers one of your other questions, is platform therapies. You know, cell and gene therapy has really grown by leaps and bounds. And the scientific, to me, what's interesting about our field is that scientifically we're outstripping our known regulatory processes. That is really my read on what's happening. And so I think that the ability to do gene replacement, the addition of CRISPR to kind of like the library of things we have to use scientifically, all of that has led to a world where the regulatory framework hasn't quite caught up. And so we are this year at the annual meeting trying to push on what would it look like to say we have a platform that includes a gene replacement. What other studies do we need to do for other gene replacements? And in that same context, is there differences if there's an indication that's for a rare disease or actually for an ultra rare disease? And I think that is something that really energizes me, is talking about that ultra rare disease pocket where, you know, I think all of us have seen the patient advocate groups that are all of these really ultra rare, tragic, early age disorders, children born with these, where almost from the day they're born, they have metabolic disorders that lead to early death. And this is the sweet spot of what can happen in gene transfer right now, right? Gene replacement can actually fix that. How do we get there? How do we literally say there's 5 patients with this disorder worldwide right now? What can we do for them? And then there's 10 patients with some other disorder that's also a monogenic disorder. How do we help those patients, maybe using the same platform? How much phase 1 do we need? How much phase 2 do we need? How many patients do we have to treat? And then separately, I think a conversation that's interesting for people in regulatory affairs is there another path that doesn't look like a fully licensed BLA? If you've only treated 5 people, is it fair to ask the FDA or the EU to license this as a product? Is it truly a study product that should have a BLA? Or is there some other sort of mechanism that allows for continued access to it? And I think that question goes into, the pre-approval stage, the phase 1, phase 2, how far do we have to go before you could say this is worthy of saying it's approvable to use without getting into unlicensed, unstudied products being available to products and being available to patients. And I think that it's really tricky, to tell you the truth. And ISCT is also very involved in this part of the field that's about not giving access to unapproved stem cell products and, having clinics that are like a massage parlor. Also, we do stem cells over here in this other room, right? I think it's a very fine line, and it's a very interesting part of the field. So I know I kind of went on a tangent there, but that's where my interest is that we are in a field that is on the cusp of changing the way patients are treated. It's on the cusp of changing what kinds of patients are treated. And the regulatory part is really the hardest. I shouldn't say that. The science is super hard, right? And it's super complicated, but the regulatory part is equally complicated. And I think that we really are trying to keep up. And I think that ISCT really has an interest in this, and I'm really proud to be part of it.
Good. Thank you so much for that detailed explanation. No tangents at all. It was all very, very useful information. So I appreciate it. I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned how, we all know how important the regulatory aspect is to cell and gene therapy. But I want to talk a little bit about the state of the global regulatory landscape, including whether it be recent and or ongoing legislative changes. So I'd like to hear from you, for our listeners, what are those changes exactly? And our listeners, what do they need to know to understand and adhere to and perhaps implement those changes that are being set forth?
So I think the most important thing to remember if you're in regulatory affairs in this field is just that the regulations themselves are unchanged. It's the implementation of the regulations that's really in transition right now. And so, for instance, in the U.S., Peter Marks has been a very vocal, very, I think, a huge advocate for helping to push the field forward. And I think that any good regulator is there to put up the safety bars, but not to be a block to research. And I think that Peter Marks and the FDA have really, really been very good at doing that. And I really appreciate how many guidance documents have come out that directly impact cell and gene therapy over the past 2 years, but specifically in the last year. I think the European Union is doing something similar. And in fact, what's interesting is that the what we call the SOHO regs, the substances of human origin regs, that have been in transition and under discussion for more than 2 years in the EU, were approved on April 24th. So that's kind of like a sign of the fact that there's been a real expansion to talk about more access, more cross-border access and standardizations and data sharing and things like that in the EU. And I think what you're seeing is that this is happening sort of worldwide, where there's just really a push on, yes, we have very strong regs around straightforward biologics, around small molecules, around devices. When we talk about cell and gene therapy, of course, sometimes those cross over. And so the whole device biologic can be sort of a blurry line, since we use so many devices to do stem cell collection and selection. And then I think behind that, it's just a time when we're really optimizing what's out there. And again, going back to what we're going to be talking about at the annual meeting, how do we make these relevant to different situations now that we have products that literally might be able to make some change in these very small pockets of patients. So I think what I would say is that for the listeners, read the guidance documents if you work in the U.S., and the same with the EU. I don't think the regs themselves are all that different, although SOHO is changing things in the European Union. I think that more than anything, it's the dialogue. And so that's where this really becomes an interesting field. And the other thing I want to point out is that ISCT is trying to make headway with countries and regions that don't have regulatory infrastructure right now. And it's important to keep in mind that it's one thing to have a product that's made, that's FDA approved, that's maybe being sold in a country that didn't approve the product, right? It's another thing to have stem cells being made in a country that has no regulatory infrastructure. And then if you include in that there's possibly gene transfer or cell manipulation, then you're talking about a whole other level of an unregulated product, right? So ISCT has been extremely active in trying to help underrepresented countries to engage in discussions with other countries that have regulations to see if we can't help them develop some sort of infrastructure. And one of the ways we actually do that is at the annual meeting. This is the second year we're having it. We're having something called the Global Regulator Summit. And the summit brings together multiple different countries to talk about different issues. Last year, we talked about unlicensed stem cell products, proliferation of those worldwide, how we could help address that issue. This year, we're focusing on rare diseases, and you can tell from my prior comments, that's a real sweet spot for me. But I think that it's really important because I think that we're really looking at a worldwide population when we talk about being able to do gene transfer. And last year, we had quite a number of people from what I would consider regions that have regulations and regulatory agencies. This year, we've really tried to push on bringing other people to the table. And so this isn't to say they don't have regulatory agencies, it's to say this is part of our outreach. We're going to have somebody from Saudi Arabia at the table. We're going to have Taiwan's going to be at the table, several Asian countries. We are really, really, really fighting to get somebody from Africa at the table. So this is going to, we of course have the US and the EU and Australia and New Zealand, but we're really trying to push and say, let's get more people at the table and have a bigger dialogue to try and make headway in how do we move these sciences forward.
Oh, that's so fantastic and so important. We're at the time that we're recording this episode, ISCT is just a few weeks away.
Yes.
But I am very hopeful that after the fact and perhaps later on this year, whenever you're able to share some data that maybe came out of that meeting, you'll join me again and we can have another episode dedicated to what was covered at that Global Regulator Summit.
I would love to do that. It's last year was so exciting. I think I was floating on air for like 3 weeks after the meeting. It's 8 hours about, and you're literally in the room with all these people who are making decisions about what's approved and what's not approved and what the regulatory infrastructure will look like. And it's just really neat. And I'm so excited about the participants this year. I just really think that this is a chance for us to make a change. So
for sure. For sure. Oh, that's so exciting. While we're on the topic of ISCT, the actual meeting that's coming up, like we said, in just a few weeks in Vancouver. I know we talked a lot about, of course, the regulator summit that you just talked about, but what are you personally hoping to learn and take away from this year's meeting?
Well, I think it's always interesting to go and hear what other sites are doing, what where things are being, what the tension points are, what we're pushing on. One of the things I find the most fascinating is actually patient access. So aside from this issue of rare diseases, aside from what's the regulatory pathway, there's some really big patient access issues. We talk about the cost of these products, right, as they get approved. What does that really look like? The Bluebird Bio story from Europe, where they ultimately had their product approved there, couldn't agree on reimbursement pulled the product, came to the US, and that product is now available in the US at $2.2 million per dose. What does that really mean? Well, that really means that for a European, the product's not there. You can't receive it. Even though it was approved, it's not there. It means that the product's not available in Africa, where the majority of the patients who would receive that product actually are. And in the US, at a price point of 2.2 million, I would argue that we really have to talk about how available is it for patients here, right? How many of us have insurance where our insurance is like, no, we won't pay for that MRI because it's not, we don't see the reason for it and it costs a lot of money. That's not even talking about a $2.2 million treatment, right? Sure. And then what the infrastructure would look like. Can insurance companies literally afford to cover all of the patients with sickle cell disease who might receive this product if it's priced at 2.2 million? So patient access is a huge thing. And I think ISCT has tried to be on the forefront of having dialogue around that. I think that it is helpful that we have different areas to talk to say, okay, well, what does it look like in the EU to get these products approved? And how are you deciding whether or not you will pay for this? Not, there's the science part, and then there's the kind of like what society can bear. And then in the US, we have a whole other infrastructure and a whole other set of problems. But that is going to be bigger and bigger problem as we move forward. As more products are approved, who's going to pay and what does the access look like? And just to go back to what I was talking about earlier with ultra rare diseases, which company is going to push forward these platforms and what is their reimbursement going to look like? So I think that that's a big part. And that's sort of one of the things that I'm hoping we'll have a lot of dialogue about at this meeting. Separately from the cost issues, there's the issues of, just access for patients who can't get the product other ways. And of course, Europe has the human subject exceptions, the HSE. We don't have anything comparable to that. We have expanded access, but it really is quite different, right? And so I think that continues to be a big point of interest for those of us in the field, is to say, what can we learn from what the Europeans are doing with HSE? And what is that going to do to sort of that competitive market that is dependent on money, right? If you start saying, well, there's no money in it, different institutions can make it and just get reimbursed for what they spent, then why would large industry invest in cell and gene therapy and push these things forward? So again, there's just so many things in our field that are so interesting that are just, I mean, I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm actually very curious to see what different people think about it.
Oh, sure. You're there to certainly be, a leader and provide information just as much as you are to absorb information. So, and those topics, especially the cost of therapies and patient access. And I mean, that is an ongoing, never-ending conversation, and hopefully we will get to some sort of even potential solution sooner than later. It's events like ISCT's 2024 meeting in Vancouver that helps us get there.
I hope so. I certainly hope so.
Exactly.
So one of the things that, as we talk about that, I think is related is patient access for pediatric patients, right? And how we get those. What are the barriers to treating pediatric patients, and how do we overcome that? And I think that with all drug development, there's always been a limited interest by industry because the patient populations there are usually smaller, right? And so they aren't as keen to push on those markets. They're like, we have prostate cancer and we have pediatric leukemia. Prostate cancer looks more interesting, right? So I think that when we talk about patient access, especially in a pediatric population, that's the first barrier that we look at, right? Is just the fact that potentially companies don't see the money in that. But then when you get past that, it really becomes, in our area specifically, a bigger and bigger problem, because a lot of our products start in pediatric populations. Look at the history of cell and gene therapy. A lot of our early research is done in children. Mm-hmm. People get grant funding. a lot of the gene therapists are at pediatric institutions. So we are treating diseases of pediatric populations. But then when you make that transition to more of the industry side, to more of the, the side where there's a focus on what's going to be the return on investment, there's kind of a mental transition. And this has been an ongoing problem in all drug development, but I think it plays out fairly large in our field, especially since, as I said, a lot of these early studies are done in pediatrics, and then it sort of falls out as the product moves along the development timeline. And I don't know if you've heard of this, but Crystal Mackel, Kath Ballard, quite a few pediatric leaders nationwide have a think tank in DC. The first meeting was last year. The second meeting is this year, that's talking about these issues and trying to bring this to the forefront. What are the issues and how do we move it forward? I think separately, there's other groups that are looking at, how do we, what can we do to help fund research that may or may not be profitable? So again, it all comes and circles back to the same things, right? Rare diseases, pediatrics is usually a rare disease, reimbursement issues, and from there, how to continue to provide therapies for the patients that really need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And keeping on the topic of pediatric patients, we just talked through some hurdles that we're facing. What would you say are you most excited about for the foreseeable future for the pediatric patient journey from a cell and gene therapy perspective?
Well, I mean, I hate to keep coming back to this, but this area of gene replacement is so fabulous to me. I don't think we've ever had a moment where we really could say that we can see on the horizon targeting specific diseases with specific treatments that were designed for that disease. Not just at a phenotypic level, like the patient has cancer, but the patient has a certain type of cancer with a certain type of marker, perhaps with a related genetic defect that we can repair. That is incredible, right? That is really personalized medicine, which we've been talking about since I've been in the field 30 years ago, personalized medicine. This is truly personalized medicine. And I think that especially in the era of pediatric, when you talk about pediatric patients, a lot of pediatric conditions are genetic, right? Because as we age, we have all of what we ate and what we drank and whether we smoked and whether we exercised. But for children, those factors are not really the factors. The factors are usually what genes were they born with and what's happening. So I think that cell and gene therapy has the potential to really impact pediatrics in a way that is much more straightforward. This is what's wrong. This is the fix for it.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, like I said, once, and I'm certain that this will be, there will be a pediatric focus of some sort at ISCT. I don't have the exact agenda in front of me, but I would bet that in some way, shape, or form it will be discussed in probably a variety of ways. And so on the back end of this, like I said, maybe later this year when the dust has settled a little bit, we can have another follow discussion about what was discussed, what was learned, and how we're going to move forward with all the data that we have.
Yes. I mean, going back to, I mentioned the Global Regulatory Task Force and the sessions we're having at the meeting. The case study we're doing that's going across 3 different sessions, and we'll address clinical questions, pharmacology, toxicology questions, and CMC questions. The case study is all about gene correction in pediatric patients. So, I mean, that's just a small example. As I said, a lot of the research in this field is done in pediatric patients. So kind of an undercurrent theme in many of the sessions will be the fact that we all know that there's pediatric patients that we're discussing in these meetings. So yes, it's a big part of the field for sure.
Good. Glad to hear. All right, well, listeners, that wraps up this episode of Cell and Gene, the podcast featuring Dr. Bambi Grilley. Bambi, thank you so much for your time and the insight you shared. And again, looking forward to having you back on after ISCT 2024 in Vancouver to talk about what you learned and what was uncovered at the show.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Good. All right, listeners, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.